Your Humanities Half-hour is brought to you by the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.
Welcome to your Humanities Half-hour. I'm Catherine Perry, and today we're chatting with the 2020 Governor's Humanities Awardee for Preservation of CNMI History, Stephanie Soder. Stephanie, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Stephanie was awarded for a project she undertook while pursuing her master's degree in maritime archaeology. She's actually an archaeologist with the Delaware State Historic Preservation Office. And as part of this project, she researched Chamorro and Carolinian post-World War II experiences. Stephanie, well, first of all, congratulations. How did you feel when you were getting a humanities award for your research?
I was genuinely shocked because I had no indication prior to getting the email that I had won that I was even nominated. So I was completely floored that somebody thought highly enough of the research to nominate me. And I was honestly so excited. I got the email about 5 o'clock in the morning and I had to wait several hours to tell anybody. And it was so hard to not call somebody that early in the morning to tell them.
What made you decide to focus on this particular topic as part of your thesis?
So I was always interested in World War II and specifically in the Pacific. And my thesis advisor, Jen McKinnon, who you've also had on the show, she handed me a book because I was having trouble narrowing down what I wanted my thesis to be. And she said, I just finished editing this book. Why don't you look through and see if there's any holes in the research that you would like to kind of fill? So I read through the entire book, and one of the essays towards the end discussed how 933 indigenous civilians had been killed in the battle, and then they were placed in internment camps, and then it just stopped. And I kind of double took and I was like, well, what happened after that? And so I started doing some research, and I was realizing that there were so many history books out there that did the same thing. And so I wanted to fill that historic research gap of, what happened after the battle, because it doesn't just stop once the battle stops. There are consequences afterwards. And that's how that kind of came to be. And I went to Jen and she said that I should do it, and which was really great because it was a maritime studies program, so internment camps, and wasn't quite up the alley, but we incorporated some maritime themes into it as well, and she believed in me and we made it happen.
I have to say, in preparing for our chat today and looking at what all you covered, you really tried to cover a lot and did cover a lot with this project, everything from what was the indigenous experience, the internment camps, how they were treated, and maritime activities. As a result of your work, you've collected 30 oral histories from indigenous Chamorros and Carolinians. Start us off with what are some of the highlights or maybe unexpected or most common things you found in the oral histories about the indigenous experience before, during, and after the Battle of Saipan?
So I think, and it wasn't surprising in any sense because everybody has a different perspective, but I think every story is different. And what I learned through collecting oral histories is that there is no black and white. It's all gray. It's often messy and sometimes it's contradictory. So you have all of these different views, and that's what makes it so important. Because one researcher I read said that you cannot understand the totality of war without getting every perspective. And because indigenous perspectives were largely missing before this, you couldn't get the whole view of the war or the battle for Saipan. So I think it was really important to bring in all of those different perspectives. And it was really important that we were able to integrate the oral histories in with what has been documented through military records and previously recorded oral histories.
Were there any points that kind of struck you personally in hearing these different perspectives from the indigenous people that, because obviously you did a lot of archival research and other types of research to prepare, but in talking to the people themselves, what did you get from that?
I think one of the most important things we got from it is really the emotional side. I don't think there was a single oral history that I collected where the person I interviewed didn't lose somebody. And I feel like a lot of research try to aim towards not having emotion in, when they try to do archaeological studies. But the oral histories are so important to getting that and understanding that this was very real for many people. And so it struck me how much emotion was there. Of course, there's emotion with things like that, but the fact that it was still there, 75 plus years later, very visible on the surface. And I'm just so honored that people were willing to share that emotion with me. And I think it really adds to the depth of the thesis and just the other deliverables as well to add in their stories.
I think a lot of people have the conception that archaeology is all about digging, or largely about digging up old stuff, finding the remains of people that have been gone a very long time. I was very interested in looking at your work to find that, there's such things now as community archaeology, indigenous archaeology. What is the perspective now when it comes to archaeology in looking at or speaking with people who are still alive or things that still exist?
There's actually been a trend lately, which I'm so happy about, of incorporating oral histories into archaeological studies. And prior to, 10, 20 years ago, that wasn't a thing. They just didn't do it. The Western idea of archaeology is that it is supposed to be, done by the archaeologist, and they are the expert. And so I wanted to incorporate these aspects of community archaeology and indigenous archaeology into my thesis to say that, I might be an archaeologist, but I am not the expert of your traditions and your heritage. So what they have started calling it, they're trying to decolonize the practice of archaeology to make sure that, especially when indigenous groups are involved and histories are involved, that the archaeologist acts as a conduit or an interpreter, and the experts are really the community members that they help try to incorporate all aspects of the archaeological study. So from start to finish, you are involving people within the community. They have a say in how it is, treated, how things and how the information is disseminated, and you do it in a way that everybody can understand. So thankfully, that is the trend. We still have a long way to go, though. It's still very Western idea of archaeology, but I'm very happy to say that I think the field is going in the right direction.
Another area of archaeology that came up was urban archaeology, and that relates to the research you did with the internment camps, specifically Camp Suzuki and Camp Chelan Kanoa in Saipan. What was the approach there? Tell us a little bit about that part of your research.
So urban archaeology is basically just archaeology occurring in developed areas or cities, because the interesting thing, I guess people don't really realize that cities are basically archaeological sites in themselves. There are layers of human life through every city, and it's just about finding them. So for Chelan Kanoa, obviously people stayed in those areas after the war was over, and there are layers of that life, even pre-war. The Japanese lived there, and then when the indigenous were put into the internment camp, and then beyond. So that was a big part of trying to figure out at what point, is there a lot of disturbance in the city or in Chelan Kanoa in that area. And Chelan Kanoa is a heavily developed area. So it's important to understand that there is still so much below the surface, even in a city setting.
I was surprised to see the list of structures you found still existing from the Japanese era. There's a lot.
Yeah, there are. A lot of them are concrete. They were built to last.
Was there anything you found that you weren't expecting to, or what did you find interesting about that part of the project?
So this was actually largely non-disturbance. So we didn't do any physical digging, but we did go around through Chelan Kanoa. We did talk to homeowners to see what they had dug up, through gardening or landscaping or construction, things like that. Had they ever turned up anything? Because in that area, there have been surveys done where they have found large troves of World War II, military equipment or military surplus, medicinal bottles, things like that. So we asked if they had ever found anything. And one story I actually loved, we caught her as she was almost leaving the house, but her mother had actually found an intact ceramic bowl. And we had somebody date it, and it looked like it was right after the war, but the mother doesn't remember ever, using that type of bowl. So when she found it, it was very interesting, and she kept it all these years. But that just goes to show that there were multiple families living in these houses during internment, and it could have been from one of those other families. So there are still things there, and they should be looked at. They're home goods, personal goods, medicinal bottles, architectural remains. These are the kind of things that you would probably find if you were going to do another survey in that area.
So for those of us that may not be aware, what is the difference, or what was the difference between Camp Suzuki and Camp Chelan Kanoa?
That's actually a really great question, because when I first started looking, there kind of didn't really seem to be a difference. People were using the terms interchangeably, and even the military documents were as well. So it was actually really interesting once we started looking and talking to people. They were starting to, I guess, as time went on, we kind of figured out that there was a difference between the two. So for Camp Suzuki, it was also called Internment Camp Number 1 by the military. Oral histories and the military docs show that it was hastily constructed right after the war, or right after the battle. Food was provided for people, but it was minimal, and everybody was put together. So Japanese, indigenous, Koreans, Okinawans, they were all together in this area. And so after some time, there was so much overcrowding and tensions began to rise between ethnic groups. So the military decided that they needed to expand. So in November of 1944, the first families moved to Chelan Kanoa, into the concrete houses that had actually survived through the battle. And then they added in wooden houses as time went on. And Chelan Kanoa was strictly for indigenous and mixed families, and it was split into 4 sections. And the indigenous were in Suzuki for probably about 4 or 5 months, and then spent the remainder of their time until July 4th, 1946 in Chelan Kanoa. So there was actually a difference. You just had to figure out how to find it. A lot of people just associate their time in internment camps as Camp Suzuki, but there is a difference between the two of them.
What would you say was the difference between the camps here in Saipan and other World War II internment camps that came up during the war or prior to the war?
It's actually, I would say they're probably more similar than they are different with these other ones. So one of the things I think people struggle with is that they compare it to the concentration camps of Germany. And we know that those were absolutely terrible. But there are different levels of internment. So the basic, definition of internment is just any unjust form of imprisonment, those that are not the result of a fair and equitable legal process. So there are many objectives for internment camps, ranging from prevention of subversion, creating work camps, ethnic cleansing, control over minds and movement of bodies. And the camp structure itself actually is a key indicator of World War II internment camps. So you have the camp, you have the fence, guards, things like that. So other World War II internment camps, especially Japanese American camps, in the US, they are very similar to these. They were provided food, accommodations, and work, even if it wasn't the best. But the camp was meant to control the minds and movements of bodies and to prevent spying. And the camp itself was a camp, and it was surrounded by a large fence, and it was guarded. And Camp Suzuki and Chelan and Kanoa were the exact same way. The biggest difference between these types of camps and Chelan, Kanoa, and Suzuki was probably why they were built. These American camps were based on fear, and they were allowed through executive orders, whereas Chelan, Kanoa, and Suzuki were built to help suppress sabotage and keep the U.S. in control of the civilian situation. But it also offered safety for the displaced people on Saipan.
Well, we're chatting today with the 2020 Governor's Humanities Awardee for Preservation of CNMI History, Stephanie Soder. And when we come back, we'll talk more about life in the camps after this break.
Did you know that you can donate up to $5,000 to the Humanities Council through the CNMI Education Tax Credit Program? Donations from individuals and corporations qualify and can be used to offset your local wage and salary tax, BGRT, and earnings tax. Call our office at 235-4785 to see how you can support humanities programs in our community and obtain a tax credit for your donation. Sizuus Maasi, Olomai, and thank you.
Welcome back to your Humanities Half-hour. Stephanie, how were the indigenous civilians treated by U.S. military personnel both during and after the battle?
So there's actually a lot of different perspectives on this and a little bit of discrepancy. Some people had really great relationships with the military, especially those who were children at the time. They remember, having really great relationships and calling the military guys Joe or Sindalu, and they would share gum with them. And the majority of oral histories collected show that the relationships were amicable, but others acknowledge that there were violent or inappropriate encounters with U.S. soldiers. I think the biggest thing that I took away from this was that the individual agency or the choices of the soldiers seems to be the most important aspect. Because many of the administration changes from higher up were focused more on practices that may have not been in the best interest of the indigenous, such as introducing, Western ideas. But overall, the soldiers basically made the choices to create good, lasting relationships.
Mm. Could you give us an idea of what a day in the life of somebody in the camps would have been like? And I imagine it was different from the children, women, and men maybe had different things going on during the day. Could you give us an example of what a day might look like for those people?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically across the board, the day started going to church. And then from there, that's where it kind of separated a little bit. So for kids, they would go to school if they were old enough. A lot of them said they did basic arithmetic, singing, and definitely had the English classes because Japanese was actually forbidden to speak. So they pushed really hard to teach English. And then from there, if they weren't old enough, they would either help with chores or go out on the farms because farming was allowed, and so was fishing in some aspects because it was important to supplement the rations that were provided by the U.S. military. And kids also remember playing games. And one of the stories that was told that sometimes the military would play baseball near the fence, and when the ball came over, they would catch it and hide it so that they could play with it later. And I love that story because it's such a kid thing to do. But for men, they would go out and work. There was an indigenous police force, and they were in charge of guarding the fence, except for the main gate, and I think the water tower was also off limits. Like I said, there was farming, there was fishing, there was handicraft cooperative. So they would craft, and then chores always had to get done. And women were usually in charge of chores or getting the rations and things like that. So typical day kind of was the same for everybody, just different for men, different for women, different for kids.
And just for clarity, why is the date of July 4th significant in relation to the Battle of Saipan?
So July 4th was in 1946 was when the internment camp was officially opened so that the indigenous could leave. But actually prior to that, they were trying to work on getting foreign nationals back to whatever country, they came from. So Japan, Korea, and, Okinawa. But they wanted to align it with July 4th because that is American Independence Day. And that is, from what I've heard, that is probably the only reason they lined it up with that.
Definitely trying to make that American connection with the indigenous people finally being able to go back to their normal residence, or maybe not residence, but their land or whatever they want, wherever they wanted to be outside
Right.
the camp. So it makes sense, of course, because your degree was in maritime archaeology, that you would spend some time in your research focusing on maritime activities. And, that's I'd never actually heard any discussion about that prior to your research project, about what was it like before the war? What were the indigenous people doing on the water? And then what happened after the war?
Yeah, so from what I gathered was that the Chamorro maritime traditions were really affected by the Spanish administration. So prior to this, it had been almost extinguished completely. But the Carolinians, they were able to hold onto their traditions through time. And there were three impacts, I think, that impacted the maritime traditions the most, and it was the battle itself, it was internment, and then it was the introduction of Western practices and ideas. So for the battle actually destroyed most of the fishing supplies because there was just utter destruction everywhere. All the fishing supplies, the boats, the nets, everything that they had that they could go out in the water prior to that was all destroyed. The internment, they restricted access to areas where they needed to be. Some of the Carolinian folks I talked to, they were talking about ingredients that they could not gather because they were not allowed to leave. Fishing was primarily done by Okinawan fishermen out in the boats, like the deep sea stuff, but some reef fishing was allowed that they do remember. Nets were made in free time, and it was kind of like a group activity to come together and do. But they could not collect boat building supplies, so boat building was largely impacted by internment. And then the Western practices probably were the largest impact because capitalism and independence, these two big Western ideas, made sure that commercial fishing ventures were, started right after the war, and the use of gill nets and dynamite fishing became popular around 1950. So the traditional maritime practices and tools slowly became obsolete, and fishing for money really became more important over sharing it with the community, which is what, was done prior to the war and even during the internment. And so the impact was really detrimental. And I think I wouldn't say it's totally detrimental now, because I feel like the younger modern generations have been showing interest in relearning these traditional, boat building, sailing, and fishing on both the Chamorro and the Carolinian side. So hopefully there's a resurrection there. But, those are three very large impacts to the point where they were almost totally disappeared.
I would say it's something really a privilege or a really great opportunity for you to have spoken to all of the individuals that you did, and for them to share their histories with you. How do you feel this project has affected you personally, if at all?
Oh, it absolutely has. I feel like before this project, I really had this view as the researcher that I deserved to know everything, that everybody should talk to me because, I'm the researcher. But talking with everybody and seeing that raw emotion and kind of coming to terms with the fact that these are stories that are shared with me because I was either trusted enough or they were ready to tell me. And I feel like I had to come to this conclusion myself that, just because I'm the researcher, it doesn't mean I deserve to know everything, and that's okay. But it's definitely influenced the way I approach archaeology. It's definitely, changed the way I approach life in general. I like to listen to people, tell stories, and I hope that I can continue to have that trust and share with people that they can come to me with stories if they have them.
Well, towards the beginning of the show, we mentioned the approach of community archaeology, and you kind of alluded to the fact that one of the responsibilities under that is to make the vast amount of information an archaeologist collects available to the public. And so I'm so happy to let our listeners know that basically the show is just an introduction, I would say, to everything that you have compiled and are willing to share with the community. So could you point us to where we can go to get more information on this research and this part
Absolutely.
of our history, really?
Yeah, absolutely. And it is yours to know. And that is one of the biggest parts of indigenous and community archaeologies, is making sure that that information is accessible by everybody who wants it. So we created a digital ebook called It Rained Fire. And it includes oral histories within the historical context of just before the war, during the battle, internment, and after. And that is available for free online. It's also available as a paperback for a small fee, but if you can get it for free, you get it for free. Like, why buy it? We also created a GIS story map for educational purposes. And the cool thing about that was that we were able to overlay photographs and videos onto maps so that people could visually see where everything was, and you can see stories. It also includes some parts of other, so not just Saipan, but other islands, and included in that. And that's also available for free. I think the link is actually on the Humanities website, so feel free to go check that out. And then, of course, if you really want to deep dive into my thesis, it is available as well. That's a heavy.
I'm usually quite adept at preparing a brief outline for each show. And I'm telling you, when I started reviewing that thesis, I got sucked in. It was so interesting. So how can people get their hands on that?
That's a great question. I don't think it's available online yet, but if anyone wants to contact me, I'm happy to provide a copy of it. I do need to find a way to disseminate it a little bit easier online, but yeah, I might even provide a copy, I think, to the Humanities Council. I think that would be a good idea, as long as I can and you guys want to host it.
A very interesting read for sure. I can imagine a project of this undertaking. There were a lot of people involved. Anybody you'd like to acknowledge?
Oh, absolutely. This project would not have been what it was without Fred Camacho. He was absolutely amazing. He was our basically our guy out in the field. He was our boots on the ground. He secured a lot of the interviews because we did try to get some interviews through the radio show that we did back in 2018 with you, and through the newspaper, but word of mouth just went so much easier. Fred was able to secure a lot of these interviews, and he was just a fun person to be around too. So he did so much of the legwork with that. I also would like to thank Genevieve Cabrera. She was also on my thesis committee. So she read that long thesis and made sure that, the indigenous perspective was properly within the context of the entire thesis. And she gave me lots of comments on that. And then, of course, Jen McKinnon, without her believing in me to do this, it definitely wouldn't have gotten to where it was. And Maddie Roth came with me to the island. We're actually on island for about 2 months, working on 3 different projects, including the one we did for the Humanities Council. So she put up with me for a very long time, and she also enjoyed, I think, doing the interviews as well. So, and then just everybody who contributed. It's your project. You deserve all of the props. It wouldn't have been what it was without you guys. So thank you for trusting me with your stories.
Well, with the care and expertise that you've given to this research, I would say you're always welcome to come back and visit us again and do another project. Any closing thoughts before we go?
I would love to come back. That's my closing thought.
All right.
No. I just want to encourage anybody who wants to tell their stories. The one thing I did see a lot of is the younger generation that we did talk to. They did want to hear these stories, and they want to know their history. And whenever you are ready to tell your story, at your own pace, I think there are plenty of people that would like to hear it.
Well, thank you so much, Stephanie, for your time today, and most especially for your energy and your thought that went into this research project to help preserve the history of the Marianas. We really appreciate it.
I really appreciate all of your faith, and thank you so much for having me.
We've been chatting today with the 2020 Governor's Humanities Awardee for Preservation of CNMI History, Stephanie Soder. And you can check out her digital book, It Rained Fire, or the GIS story map, if you would like to know more about this project. This has been your Humanities Half Hour. I'm Catherine Perry.
This program was supported by a We the People grant awarded to the Northern Marianas Humanities Council from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the Northern Marianas Humanities Council.